I'm Rob Trzynski. This is Symposium, where we talk about the ideas at the basis of a free society. My guests today are David Baer, who's a professor of theology and philosophy at Texas Lutheran University, and Dalibor Rohac, research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Now, David, I want to talk to you a little bit about, you're a professor of theology and philosophy, but you've been writing a lot and are very well informed about Hungary. I want to talk a little bit about what your connection is to Hungary as to why you've been a prominent person to talk about this.
Okay. My personal story connection with Hungary is that basically my wife is Hungarian, and we met in 1990 in American graduate school. And so I married a Hungarian and spent a lot of time. I lived many years in Hungary. And then I did by trade, I'm a theologian, and I did my doctoral dissertation on the Lutheran Church in Hungary under communism. And I went to Hungary. I said, I better do this if I really want to learn Hungarian. So I did. I did this. I actually was the first person, even among the Hungarians, to do sort of a survey of the entire Lutheran Church under communism in this period. And so I learned Hungarian. I did other things, and then, but I wasn't really a political commentator. And then it just sort of this odd thing. Viktor Orban became prime minister in 2010 and started just turned Hungary into an autocracy. And I just got involved writing commentary because I know Hungary very well, basically better than most of the people. Not very many people know Hungarian, and so I just sort of backed into it, basically. Thanks to Viktor Orban, really.
Well, thanks to Viktor Orban, and thanks also to the fact that Americans tend to not really know much about the rest of the world, and so we need people who have traveled there, who have long. And I noticed, I tend to avoid commenting too much about the politics of other countries because it takes a long period of involvement of knowing who people are and what's happened and what the history has been over a period of decades to be able to really understand what's going on there. So you either have to be from Hungary or have spent a long period of time there and know a lot of Hungarians. But so you mentioned Viktor Orban turning Hungary into an autocracy. And part of the reason I wanted to have the two of you on here is because this has become relevant to American politics, because you have a lot of people going around in the last few years who have been recommending Hungary as a model. And what Viktor Orban is doing, the current leader of Hungary, has been doing as a model for what American politicians, especially American conservative politicians, should be doing. And so I wanted to sort of look at what that model actually is, what it means in practice, what are the elements of it, so we can better understand, not just what's going on there, but also how it serves as a model for other countries and what it means as a model for the U.S. So I want to start with the question. Now, David, you just left off by saying Orban turned Hungary into an autocracy. So I want to talk about, is it really an authoritarian system? Does it actually deserve that label? And what is the nature of the system they have there?
Okay, well, one question you asked was about the, what's the nature of, the last question was the nature of Hungary, and I'll answer that. And then the previous question was about Hungary being a model for the United States. So I just want to say that, the idea that Hungary is a model for the United States is absurd. Hungary is a country, of 9.5 million people. It's the size of Indiana. It's very, not very densely populated. And the kinds of things that Orban could do in Hungary are completely impossible. It couldn't be done in America, and there's just it's just silly. It's silly from the point of view of the people who are in favor of Orban. We could implement Orban's system in America. It's totally impossible, and to some extent the people who I really don't. think there are lots of problems in American politics, but I don't think we're going to become like Orban's Hungary. So that's not going to happen. It's not possible. So, okay, I want to answer that question. We can talk about that more if you want.
Yeah.
In terms of how Orban, what kind of system does Orban created? Well, I think he's created a system that is, I don't know exactly what the term for it is, but it's very hard to imagine Orban being removed from office through democratic means, through democratic elections. So in my view, his position is completely secure. Sometimes I think I just don't see it happening. It's hard to imagine how it ends. Now, what is he? It's not an authoritarian, it's not a totalitarian state or anything. There's still individual freedoms, but he's he's managed to sort of totally secure his hold on power. And I think it's because he completely controls the media, or he has a total widespread control of the media. This is an important element in his control of Hungarian society. He created an electoral system after coming to power, which just makes it impossible for an opposition to emerge in a viable way to challenge him. So that's the second thing. And then thirdly, he benefits from emigration, from the fact that Hungarians who don't like what's happening in Hungary just leave. They can go to the EU. And this means that it's kind of an escape valve. And so the people who are really unhappy with Hungary just leave, and that sort of reduces the pressure to try to change the system. And it actually makes Orban, sort of more popular electorally. So that would be my view of, what's going on there. He can't. It's not an authority. It's so I call it. I don't know. It's an autocracy. But it's not like you are. And your freedom is restricted in certain ways, especially if you don't like the system or you want to critique the government and so forth. But otherwise, if you go to Hungary, you don't feel that you're living in an authoritarian or a totalitarian state. You can live a normal life as long as you keep your head down.
Well, and that I think is the definition of this sort of new model of authoritarianism, which is you can live a normal life so long as you keep your head down. Dalibor, do you have a view on what you would call that system, or how we describe that system?
I think the sort of baseline, sort of technical name for a regime like Orban's is one of a hybrid regime or a flawed democracy, one that doesn't really allow for really competitive fair elections with a level playing field. I think that the right metaphor or sort of point of comparison is really look at Russia maybe 12 years ago, before the regime really started tightening the screws like in the earnest, right? There was a period when Putin was able to provide stability, sense of economic prosperity and growth in exchange for people just staying out of the political process in a way. And Orban has done that to some extent. I mean, engaging in public and political life is demoralizing, is kind of pointless, and it's just asking for trouble in Hungary. I mean, it's very hard for the opposition to compete on a level playing field because of the way the electoral system is structured. It's very hard. You can publish freely, but to reach large audiences, you really face massive obstacles because much of the big influential press is concentrated in the hands of one organization, essentially controlled by the ruling party. The advertising market is very small and also controlled by the government and state-owned enterprises. So in a way, there is a sort of facade of multiple voices and pluralism, like there was in Russia in the Northeast, without much influence on the sort of political and policy outcomes. I mean, it's kind of funny. You look at Hungary today. There is this sort of debate about Finland's and Sweden's accession to NATO, where the president of the country, Katalin Novák, is saying something slightly different from the prime minister. And apparently there is a lively debate among members of parliament from Fidesz. And I think that is a sort of one of those sort of charades that are sort of supposed to create an impression of a truly sort of lively, pluralistic system, where in the end we all know that it is Viktor Orban who is calling the shots, and all of that is done without the Gulag, without concentration camps, like relying largely on people being too demoralized to sort of engage in politics in the earnest, and when they do so, they'll just sort of run into obstacles that make the job impossible.
Yeah, I think the comparison to Russia 10 or 12 years ago is an interesting one, and I think very apt. And I think it's interesting that, if you look at the American version of it, when you have people saying, the sort of people who are saying, praising the Hungarian model and praising Viktor Orban in America now are the sort of people who a few years ago would have been recommending Vladimir Putin and Russia as a model. But of course, that's become, especially in the last year, has become much more disreputable to do. So they've switched to, look, this is the warm, fuzzy version of it, the less obviously oppressive version of that same system. So they switched from Russia to Hungary. Now I want to take apart the different elements of what that sort of model is, of how the system is run, because and I think to defend the relevance of this, I think David, you mentioned that this is something can't be done in America, in a country, wide and diverse country of 340 million people. But also you mentioned, it's about the size of Indiana. And so the thing is, I think what's going to happen is it can't be done nationally. It'd be very hard to do nationally, but I think it can be done in Indiana. It can be done on the state level to some extent, that some elements of this can be done because you have that. It becomes easier on the state level for, governors have much more power, that it's easier to maybe gain control of the legislative system. And I think we have some experiments with that. So I want to look at what those elements are so we can sort of recognize them when they're being experimented with here. So one of the things I want to talk about is, you talked about the electoral system in Hungary. And I know that Viktor Orban has sort of taken advantage of, my impression is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that in Hungary, there is very much like there is in the US. There is sort of an urban, a rural versus urban, sort of cosmopolitan versus traditionalist cultural divide. And Orban has very much appealed very strongly to that, and to the idea of giving more electoral weight to the countryside to sort of shout down the more cosmopolitan voices in the cities.
Yeah. Okay. So, look, I don't want to dispute there's relevance to thinking about, since so many people are enamored with Orban in America. That is, but this I get asked this question a number of times about this rural or urban divide, and I'm not a total expert on the electoral, on the that's sort of a polling or question, but it's actually a misconception that Orban flourishes through this urban rural divide. I think that the reality is that Orban gets his support from all layers of society. It's not like people who live in the cities are all liberal in Hungary and hate Orban, and the people who live in the country are all like conservative. It actually isn't true. Orban gets support, plenty of support from the middle class. He definitely gets support from the poor people. He gets it in every layer of society. What's different is, the reason why this perception, what's different is that he doesn't have the sort of total support in the urban environment like he does it basically in the countryside. He gets whatever 90% of everyone votes in the countryside for Orban. The reason why this perception exists in the United States is because if you look at a map of Hungary after an election, you see, the cities, or Budapest voted for the opposition, and then the country voted for Orban. But that the opposition barely won in Budapest, and they got clobbered in the countryside. So why is that? Okay, I mean, I don't. There's only theories. My theory is, there's several reasons. Orban, has created a system where people are dependent on the regime, and it was always the case in Hungary. In the countryside, there was a kind of incumbent advantage because people there is very poor. They they get bribed. Their votes can get bribed. They can be influenced. They don't really want to shake anything up because they might get favors. So there was that even predated Orban. But it's gotten much stronger now because no one believes the opposition can win. And there's nothing, therefore, that the opposition can offer anybody in the countryside, because they're not going to win. And so people just want to stick with the Fidesz because it's safe. They know what they're going to get. They'll get a little flavor here. The mayor will help them or something like that. So his control on the countryside is pretty much complete. And then, of course, there's no information in the countryside. There's no access to, unless you're like internet savvy, to free press, right? So you don't know what's going on in the urban environments. And it's like Budapest. If you're unhappy with the regime, you're probably more savvy and you have access to an independent media. I think that's a big factor. I mean, there is an independent media in Hungary. It's very small and it's mostly access through the internet. And you can get, if you want to, you can get the information. So maybe a slightly more educated, slightly more savvy voting group, he's lost support among those groups. But so I think that the reason why the map looks that way is because There's a little more independence in the cities, and there's a little more access to actual information for those who want it. And in the countryside, there's total dependence on Orban or Fidesz patronage, and the people in the countryside really don't have access. They don't know what's going on, and they rely on the state media, which is essentially everything. They rely on the local papers, which are basically state media. Unless they're internet savvy and go on the internet, they don't know what's going on.
Well,
I think go ahead.
I think some of this connects too to the issue of the business environment there, and sort of the absence of an independent business interest or business community or independent support, economic support and that's tied into economic support for the media. But I want to talk about the business issue too, which is, my impression is that he's created sort of a system where there are so many favors and the government sector is so large that basically if you want to run a business and you want to be able to get along and have that business be able to prosper, you need to be in good shape with the government. You can't be someone who stands out prominently against it. Is that the case, Dalibor?
I think that's roughly speaking correct. One has to take into account the size of the country, right? Like we are talking about a country of 9.7 million people, which acts for sort of most practical purposes and as an extension of the German auto manufacturing industrial complex, so to speak. So Hungary is home to large plants of companies like Audi and others, and all kinds of suppliers to the auto industry. And I would argue that many of those sort of international supply chains are sort of living in a bubble of sorts where they are faced with fairly low tax and regulatory burden, very predictable environment. They don't really face any incentives to try to rock the boat politically. And it's a very different world for businesses and entrepreneurs that are indigenous, if you will, built and grown by Hungarian entrepreneurs themselves. The government plays a big role as a source of public spending, and I would argue that some of the problem has really been exacerbated by the inflow of EU funds, of the money that Hungary has been entitled to after joining the European Union, which manifestly should serve to improve the infrastructure, bring underdeveloped regions up to closer to the sort of European levels of economic development. But in Hungary's case, over the past 13 years, it has served as a way of building a system of patronage around Fidesz, where you can have a very comfortable life, just not just steering away from politics, or in fact trying to sort of mobilize political support for Fidesz whenever asked to do so, and in return you get access to all kinds of public procurement contracts, infrastructure, green projects, green energy, etc., and much of it has been, in fact, subsidized by the European taxpayer.
That's interesting, because that's an old problem with development aid, which is that when the development aid goes into the hands of the central government, it often becomes then a tool of patronage, a tool of saying, well, here's this flow of money that will go to our friends and won't go to anyone who opposes us.
You see similar versions of the same story elsewhere in the region, but I don't think anywhere else has the system been so centralized and so perfected in sort of and placed in the hands of a very small group of people as in Hungary. Like, Poland is a very polarized country and has a problem of its own. But there you can, you go to Poland and you sort of see that these EU funds have actually improved the infrastructure quite dramatically, and sort of see it in various sort of assessments of the effectiveness and absorption rates of EU funds. And you have problems with corruption elsewhere, but at least you have sort of competing factions trying to get access to this source of funding. Whereas in Hungary, really for the past 13 years, there has been one party in power that has sort of entrenched itself in a way that really makes it very difficult for the opposition to compete.
Well, and you talked about this issue of Hungary being a small country, and the business environment is very connected to things outside of it. And one of the things I know that Orban has done is essential to his thing has been basically trying. There's been restrictions on foreign media, because the idea is, if you not having a German media company, a very large German media company have, a Hungarian extension, but trying to sort of make foreign media the enemy. And that has been part of the idea of controlling the media. But the other part about this that I, to my knowledge, is that media was never really privatized fully after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, after the fall of communism. There was still very much a heavy state involvement in media, but in the early years after communism, it was sort of shared and spread out among multiple parties, and has been sort of consolidated since then.
I think sorry, David, please go ahead.
Go ahead,
David.
Okay,
David first.
Let's see. Well, of course, in Hungary, actually, describing the Hungarian media situation, I think, they give the simple, it's not nuanced position, is that you have a massive state media. It's disguised in the fact that there are various oligarchs who actually, there were oligarchs who own this media, but they put everything into a big nonprofit organization. I forget the name of it.
Kisma.
Kisma is what it is in the Hungarian abbreviation, and it's basically this big so almost all of the media in Hungary is owned by this big foundation, but the foundation is run by Orban people. Right, so it's essentially state-run, but it's not officially state-run. So you have this sort of, in Hungary, you kind of, it's not exactly the same, but you have a kind of party state. You have Fidesz and you have the state, and they help each other out. And so you have this. So in Hungary, you essentially have state media. I don't think it's the state media that's not acknowledged as state media. Then, of course, you have state media like, whatever, like they have in Britain, the BBC, or you have in Germany. You have the official Hungarian channels and the state radio. And that you get a lot of really thick propaganda on those things. But then you have this large swath of supposedly independent media that's not, at least not state media, that just gives you various kinds of Hungarian propaganda. I mean, there's even different levels. There's some that's a little slicker, it's for more educated people. You have some that's really crude, but it's all basically behind the government. I don't think it's the case that you didn't have private media. I mean, after the before Viktor Orban, you had independent medias, and basically what Orban did was he drove them. He made them sort of economically non-viable, because he wouldn't put in all of these media, like newspapers, they're dependent on sort of government advertising, and so he wouldn't put any government advertising in the independent press. So they had financial problems. He would sort of warn businesses that don't advertise in these independent presses, and so basically they become economically unviable. They have to sell. They're bought up by an Orban oligarch. And eventually they were put into this big foundation. So Orban drove out the almost completely the independent media by making it unviable, by basically punishing anyone who did business with the independent media.
And what that means is that the people who survive have to survive on a very small scale. And it's
right. And there is an independent media in Hungary. I mean, it's not as if it's just very small. And it's kind of a niche, right? It's mostly accessible on the internet, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. And you can get information, but you got to really search it out. And it's not in the sort of common, outlets on the
that's actually a result of deliberate policies. So you had not so long ago a radio like Klub Radio, which was able to broadcast freely throughout the country. It had its license revoked, so they only operate online now, and their audience is much smaller as a result. And those sort of arbitrary license policies when it comes to broadcasting have affected TV and radio alike, very often with almost no pushback from the West. So there was an interesting case a few years ago in Poland where one of the independent news channels, TVN, which was owned by Discovery, was threatened by a special piece of legislation threatening to revoke its license. And the US, back then the Trump administration, and George Mosbacher, who was the U.S. ambassador to Warsaw, were very vocal about this not being acceptable as a sort of treatment of U.S. investors. We just didn't really have comparable cases or comparably salient cases in Hungary, and I presume governments of, say, Germany, Austria, etc., that have become that were in the sort of crosshair of these kinds of policies, but not anywhere near quite as vocal.
Now, is it so? It's partly a matter of starving out the independent media, but then also using various regulations and licensing in an arbitrary way to shut them down.
Well, with Club Radio, definitely. That's right. It's both of those techniques.
Now, let's take a look at another thing that I think is actually one that has been watched eagerly by certain people in America, which is the approach to education and to higher education in particular. Like I remember watching the case of the Central European University, where you had George Soros coming in wanting to fund a sort of elite educational program in Hungary, and having that special legislation passed to sort of push it out. And then Viktor Orban comes in with the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, which is sort of his answer to that, his version of an elite educational program, but organized around sort of nationalist values.
Okay, so those are a little different. Okay, so this well, if we start with Central European University, Orban is restructuring higher education too, and I think it's kind of the same strategy. He's trying to starve out the things he doesn't like, and then he's reorganized so that most of these universities are in a kind of foundation nonprofit with a board that's full of politicians, fetus people who supposedly hold their positions for life. Right now, there's this conflict with the EU about that. But so Central European University was just an independent university that Orban. Well, okay, here's my view. What happened? It's a little. I guess it's not a consensus. Orban was picking on the CEU. All right, he wanted it because he didn't like it that there is an independent university, and he tried to adopt the strategy that he adopts with anyone he doesn't like, is which is to sort of put the people don't like in a kind of totally tenuous situation where they can't really survive. They're always sort of dependent on the good favor of the government. So CEU's position was sort of legally unclear, and they were always going to have to like negotiate again and try to be on good terms with Orban, and then maybe he would let it go a little longer. So he didn't technically kick CEU out. He put it in this situation where its legal status was very unclear. And CEU said, okay, we're leaving. They could have stayed, actually. They could have stayed and fought it out if they wanted, but they said, we can't fight it. We're not going to be a university like this. We want to be a university. We're not really interested in being in the middle of a political battle, and so we're leaving. We're not going to play this game. And so, Orban, he did drive CEU out, but my sense is he didn't actually. I'm not sure that was what he wanted so much. Or he just sort of the CEU wasn't going to play his game. And anyway, I don't know that Dalibor agrees with that or not. I don't know. Anyway, that's my perception of what happened.
So first of all, I would say just like how unique CEU was in the Central European context. So this was set up in the 1990s. Initially, George Soros considered Prague to be the place to set it up. It was met with some skepticism from the then Václav Klaus government. Went to Hungary, and he created a sort of array of graduate programs that were comparable to very fine US graduate programs, and for close to 20 years it educated elites not just in Central and Eastern Europe but even across the post-Soviet space. It was one of the real centers of scholarship on post-communist transitions. There was a really sort of vibrant intellectual academic scene that made Budapest like one of the really interesting go-to places, whether you were, a left-leaning academic or neoliberal economist like myself. And it is a massive loss for Hungary not to have this place. And Matthias Corvinus College is nowhere near being a sort of satisfying replacement. It is true that there were these legal issues around whether CEU was it was issuing both sort of US accredited degrees and Hungarian degrees, and Hungarian authorities were saying that this was basically creating an uneven playing field relative to other Hungarian universities that didn't have that sort of privilege of issuing US degrees. But I mean, that kind of model is used, I mean, across Eastern Europe by other institutions of higher learning. There is CERG, the Center for Graduate Education in Economics in Prague, that does the exact same thing as CEU did. It was just sort of legalistic stuff aimed with the explicit purpose of just driving the operations of CEU difficult and uncertain. And to me, I think that the right response should have been to dig in and stay and broadcast to the world images of professors and deans of graduate studies being dragged through the corridors by Hungarian police. I think they should have done that rather than pack their bags and gone to Vienna. I understand why they did what they did. I mean, they have also responsibility towards the student body, the staff, etc. But I think it sort of lost some of the political salience it could have had even in the United States.
And you talk about the legalisms, bearing it legalisms, because there's that old saying, I can't remember who it came from, but for my friends everything, for my enemy is the law.
I mean, that's the exact same thing that Putin is doing was doing rather. Like, I don't think there are many sort of truly international institutions of higher learning in Russia left. But places like, what was it, the European University of St. Petersburg, like, faced the exact same challenges to the point when they just gave up. And that's how these regimes operate.
Right. Let me just say, so, I mean, I think that the thing that CEU was a great thing for Hungary and for Central Europe. It was, and it wasn't this sort of propaganda that it was this, Soros University and it was propagating liberal stuff. I mean, it had all sorts of programs going on, not necessarily liberal, and it was lots of high caliber scholarship, and it benefited everybody who was in Hungary. And when they were trying to push CEU out, then even the faculty at one of the Reform University in Budapest, which is a total fetus stronghold, they spoke out against it until they were told to shut up because it was bad for everybody. And I also tend to think that with Dalibor that they should have stayed, but that the university didn't want to do that because they wanted to be a university, and lots of faculty, probably the most of the faculty, were not interested in being, I don't know what you call it, crusaders or anything, and they didn't want to leave. So anyway, now the thing about the MCC, the other thing you mentioned, it's not even a university. Okay, it doesn't issue degrees. It's like a kind of casual university or collegium, they call it, where for people who want to sort of like stimulate themselves, right, or something alongside of their degree pursuing education. And it's basically just full of Orban people, and they offer these classes, and they're building offices or campuses all over Hungary, all right, not just in Budapest. But they're not offering degrees. They're just like, you can go and have like a FIDES seminar, and it has a ton of money. I don't have the number, right, but I mean it's been endowed with more money.
Yeah, there was some like giant government fund that they were basically given. Yeah, it's
got more money than the entirety of Hungarian education or higher education outside of it. So it doesn't offer degrees. It's not really a university. It's not a university at all. And it's better funded than the rest of the higher education in Hungary. So, I mean, that is just a propaganda outlet.
Well, one function I can tell you that I think it does perform is I've seen this sort of drumbeat of American intellectuals on the right who have been invited on these junkets to Hungary. And they go and they give talks, and they are treated extremely well. And they come back and report about how great things are in Hungary and what a great model this is. And I even saw one talk about how, somebody who had been treated badly in American universities, through cancel culture and that sort of thing, goes to Hungary and says, "Oh, this is, academic freedom is alive and well in Hungary." And I'm thinking, well, what against the evidence of what happened to the Central European University? But I think it does serve a function of being like a little showcase that you could put, and you could bring intellectuals from other places in Europe, intellectuals from America. You could bring them in, and you can sort of impress them that, hey, values that you like are being supported here.
That's right. That's its function. I think one of the MCC fellows, I don't have the name, was just sort of stopped or questioned in England because they thought he was a Russian spy. So it was either the MCC or Daniel Institute. I can't remember exactly where, but yeah, it's a propaganda outlet. That's all MCC is, and it's highly financed at the cost of actual Hungarian education. And I mean, right now in Hungary, you have.
I saw some protests recently about teachers protests on this isn't on the college level, but the lower levels.
Lower down, yeah, and you know the Hungarian teachers, you don't have anybody who wants to be a teacher, sort of a pre-college teacher. They haven't had salary. They basically earn the minimum wage. They have to work money, have to work several jobs, and there's nothing being done, or hardly anything being done to improve their situation. At the same time that Orban has thrown a lot of money into this MCC, this so-called collegium that doesn't actually give degrees.
I mean, there's another sort of related anecdote from last year or year before, when the Hungarian government was in talks with the Fudan University in Shanghai about them setting up a campus in Budapest, whereby the overall cost to the Hungarian treasury would again exceed the total budget of all public universities combined, and Hungary was going to take a loan through, I guess, the Belt and Road Initiative to sort of finance that project. And that prompted massive public backlash in Budapest. So you had protests in the streets, local councils renaming the surrounding streets around the would-be campus to things like, you know, the Tibet Street and the street of the Xinjiang martyrs. And there was some really high quality trolling by the Hungarian opposition and civil society, and eventually the Hungarian government did backtrack, and so the project was not going ahead.
You know, that's interesting. It's very typical of the Belt and Road Initiative because, you know, it's this thing that seems like, oh, China's going to help these people. We're going to help you with your development. We're going to put a university branch there, but it usually means we're actually going to put you into debt to a very large extent, you know, by having you take out loans to us for this. And oftentimes, you know, what it turns out when you take these things apart, you know, they build a port or a harbor somewhere, and when you take it apart, what really ends up happening is it was a way for them to bribe public officials, essentially. That it was, you know, this giant loan taken out to build this harbor ends up going to, all the contracts go to people who are connected to the government in whatever local country this happens. And so it really becomes a way of sort of China buying influence with the local regime through corruption. And I suspect that's also part of the attraction of that particular project. So this leads us to a larger question of, you know, how is this working out for Hungary? So I've been seeing reports, for example, they've had, you know, a major problem with inflation recently. What are the actual, I mean, to some extent, Hungary has been growing a lot since the end of communism, as, you know, getting rid of communism itself is a major advantage. But how have the results been working out for Hungary in terms of, you know, people's actual lives, the actual development of the country?
Okay, well, I think that, you know, I mean, things have changed a lot because of the war. So since this war in Ukraine, I mean, things have gotten really pretty bad in Hungary. There's very high inflation. I mean, I don't know what it was last, like 20% or something.
24, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So very high. You have this problem with inflation. You definitely have for a long time in Hungary, you have a very big divide between rich and poor. So you have it seems like emerging a kind of permanent underclass, especially in the countryside. And so, Hungary doesn't even publish its the official, so the percentage of who are in the poverty line. It doesn't make that information in public. So it does have problems. It's not doing better than the other countries around it. But I mean, Orban did deliver to his sort of constituencies. It's a lot of it's middle class with very, very friendly, like pro-family subsidies, and you know, people. There is a small middle class which has emerged. So some people's lives have gotten better in Hungary. If you go to Budapest, you people there, I think, are doing okay. Although I'm sure with the inflation, it's much worse now in the war. If you go to the countryside, especially the eastern part of the country, it's really, it's really just much worse.
I mean, there is just so much of Hungary's overall economic performance that's driven by exogenous factors, specifically, the German economy and the auto industry and all those sort of supply chains that really operate almost independently of whatever policies there exist in Hungary. So it is not that Hungary would be, lagging terribly behind its neighbors, but I would argue that there is somewhat of a gap opening between, say Poland or the Baltic states and Hungary. And it's partly through Hungary's failure to sort of create, an economic environment where you can have, bottom-up initiative and entrepreneurship and things that can happen without you being, in compliance with sort of the local party bosses. And I think one testament to that is just the sort of demographic outlook, right? So when Orban came to power, the Hungarian population was 10 million, now is 9.7, in spite of very explicit commitment to boost fertility rates and shower young families with money and so on and so forth. The sort of rate of return on those policies has been relatively small, and I would argue that it's just driven by the fact that when you ask young people, Hungary doesn't strike you as an obvious place to sort of be planning to build a future for yourself.
Well, because you mentioned, I think David mentioned earlier, the fact that, a lot of people are leaving. And it strikes me as there's a contrast there to, for example, the Baltic states. The Baltic states are tiny little countries, but they are, very strong centers of entrepreneurship and lots of startups and that kind of energy that I think comes from having a very sort of vibrant, intellectually vibrant and free society. And then if you don't have that, you get sort of energetic young people going elsewhere in search of opportunity.
And people have left the Baltic states too since joining the EU, but I think there has been much more sort of back and forth, and it just, feels like a much healthier environment, so to speak.
Yeah, I think there's, in general, in Eastern Europe, I don't know the detail, the statistics for some of these other countries, but there is a general problem of people wanting to leave. There's a kind of migration to Western Europe in general, that maybe it's accelerated in Hungary by people who just don't like the political environment and want to leave. I think that's true. And I think if you look at Hungary, I think the long-term prospects in Hungary is that you just seem to you're having a very large, sizable poor, population. I mean, people say, Hungary is becoming like a Latin American country or South American country. And I don't know if that's true. Maybe it's a little bit exaggerated, but you can see a kind of trend in that direction. And you have, you don't have a educated workforce, and you have problems that seem in terms of the future. It's hard to see. It's putting Hungary in a worse position.
Well, I do want to mention there is that general issue that with the opening up of the European Union, where it's a lot easier to migrate across borders, that there is that attraction to go to Western Europe because these are wealthier countries and there's a lot of opportunity there. I remember going to London a number of years ago and thinking, okay, I'll see a lot of British people, and when you're at the hotels and the restaurant, it's like it's all Poles and Spanish. They're all very few actual British people in a lot of these service jobs, because you had this. It was early on at the very first wave of sort of EU immigration there. Now maybe after Brexit that'll be different, but so there is going to be that. But there also the sense that in some of these cases in Eastern Europe you also have very rapid growth and a sort of a dynamic society and lots of entrepreneurship that they're known for, and I think that's the thing that might be endangered by not investing in education. What strikes me about these efforts they've done to say, okay, we're going, and they have these subsidies, we're going to encourage people to have more children by having the subsidies. The biggest subsidy, or one of the biggest inducements you can give people to have kids, is high quality education, right? And this is the basic problem that you have in a lot of American cities is, the expensive thing about having kids is you don't want to send your kids to the public schools. The public schools are no good. You have to pay for a private school, and that's what makes having children so expensive. And it strikes me that you have these flashy initiatives that Hungary is doing while not supporting the actual education for kids that would be a huge inducement for parents.
True, and then the also have lots of problems in Hungary with the healthcare system, which has been neglected. And basically, Orban hasn't invested a lot of energy in these kinds of projects that actually would require sort of like good governance. I mean, fixing an education system or addressing healthcare. These are harder problems to fix, and it's not so clear you can steal money. It's not as easy to steal money, and so he's focused on other things. And you do have a growing crisis, and there's the stuff about the teachers is now in the news, and there's also a lot of complaining with doctors and healthcare. So you do have what look like crises brewing in Hungary. It's hard to see how that's going to, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. There's more and more dissatisfaction, but I myself have a hard time imagining that it results in Orban like losing or being thrown out of office, because I personally don't think it's possible in this system. So I don't know what the direction is.
If I may just add one sort of small element of this, which is related to your initial question of how, it's been working out for Hungary. So since Orban came to office in 2010, he's been very consistent in trying to reach out to particularly China. He's been praising China consistently. He has set up these bilateral summits very early on. He, at some point called Hungary a pillar of the Belt and Road Initiative. Huawei moved to Hungary to set up a logistics center very early on. But arguably, by and large, the Chinese, like elsewhere, have under-delivered on the economic front. So there's this big, high-speed railway from Budapest to Belgrade in Serbia, funded with Chinese money and built under the auspices of the Belt and Road Initiative. But overall, and given the sort of political costs that Hungary has incurred in terms of its credibility in the West, in terms of how it's being perceived, particularly in the United States, I just don't think that the economic rewards, whatever those are, justify this sort of multipolar foreign and sort of geo-economic policy that Orban has pursued. And obviously, Russia is a separate chapter, but a related one whereby in the current political conversation, Orban is blaming basically the high energy prices and all the costs associated to the war in Ukraine. He's blaming all of that on Brussels, on the sanctions regime, on the pressure from America for Europe to sort of comply with what he describes as sort of anti-Russian crusade almost.
Well, on that.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
This is the interesting question about Orban, and it has to do with the Ukraine war. Orban has completely doubled down on his pro-Russia policy, and even with this war in Ukraine. And it's very hard to see why. I mean, what's he getting out of it? And when you talk to people in Hungary, no one can quite figure it out. They have different, maybe he's being blackmailed, which I don't think is very likely. But he's getting nothing. He's getting nothing out of it. And yet he seems to have, or nothing clearly out of it. And yet he seems to have doubled down on it.
That leads me to the question I just have to ask, which is, Orban wasn't always like this. I mean, my understanding. I mean, it's kind of interesting. You see some of these people change. I mean, even I know somebody who knew Vladimir Putin in the 90s, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, where he was known as a reformer, and he seemed a little odd, but not that unusual of a guy. And I just saw recently, somebody has a Twitter feed called Young Viktor Orban, and it's a series of quotes from Viktor Orban from the 1990s and from 15, 20 years ago, where he had very different views. Is this a case of sort of power corrupts, or that he once in office and once endowed with this sort of autocratic power, that he shifts ground and becomes a sort of has different values and different priorities than he used to?
Well, it's always speculation what's going on in the mind of a politician, but that's not my view. Is that Orban? He was always interested in politics, and he was always attracted to politics, probably because of the power, right? The power and money. And even when he was young, that's what interested him, right? And he showed a discipline in terms of pursuing politics that surpassed anybody else in Hungary. And then he just adopted views, this would be my interpretation, that were conducive to his gaining power. Right? He sort of just took I think this biographer of Orban is Joseph Debrecen. He once said Orban, who actually was an advisor for Orban for a little while, said Orban can convince himself of anything if it aligns with his interests. So I think when in the 1990s, everybody was pro-democracy, and Orban, would say these things and he was in the opposition because it was in his interest, right? And then later on, he pretty much switched pretty early. He moved to the right when he saw that there was a collapse in Hungary in the right, and there was an opening there in the sort of the political landscape. And he came into power. He lost his first. He was thrown out of. He had his first government in I think 98 to 2002. He lost, and after that, he just decided that he didn't want to lose again, and he started thinking about how he would get in power and stay there. So to me, what's constant in Orban's life is his ambition, his desire for power, and he just convinces himself of different things if it suits the sort of will to power. I mean, that would be the way I would interpret it, but I mean, who knows? Because I don't think there was a true. I think Orban believes the things he says today, okay, at some level, but I don't know that there was some great examination, but I don't know.
It's like the old Seinfeld line: "It's not a lie if you believe it."
Yeah, right. That's true.
But I want to end with one thing, which is one parallel I'm drawing here that I think is not really a concrete parallel, but more an attitude, which is this sense of a politics that's defined around the culture war rather than governing, right? Rather than here are concrete problems that we can solve, healthcare, education, what have you, that there's a lot of, at least what we see, what I see from the American perspective, because that's what's broadcast out here, is a lot of culture war posturing. We're defending traditional society. We're against wokeness. We're standing up for traditional values. And that becomes the focus of politics, rather than the much less glamorous and much more difficult questions of, how do you fix things? How do you create systems that work?
Well, I think a lot of that culture war stuff that you see from Orban is for Western consumption. At least, I mean, the stuff on the transgender and the gay stuff that's just basically, those aren't really vital issues in Hungary. That's for Western consumption. I think where Orban, the part of the culture war that Orban that is sort of appeals to Hungarians has to do with maybe the nationalism, right? And that he's defending Hungary's national traditions against whatever the West and the East, or anyone who doesn't respect them. And he's a strong leader. He's standing up finally for Hungary. And of course, that after communism, all of these countries in Eastern Europe had to sort of suppress their own sort of national identities, and so this sort of nationalism and Hungarianism appeals to a lot of voters and older voters in Hungary. So that's authentic. I mean, that's part of his domestic politics. But some of the stuff is just for, I think, is just for foreign consumption.
It's for Rod Dreher to put it in his columns.
Yeah, Rod Dreher.
So unlike, let's say, in Poland, where you have an actual Catholic integralist in government, where these are genuinely sort of divisive, polarizing issues, I don't think that the same is true of Hungary. So certainly, it's not true of Viktor Orban, who, as I understand it, is a sort of lukewarm Lutheran.
Calvinist. He was a Calvinist.
Calvinist of sorts. But what worries me though about the connection to America is that I was trying to encourage everybody to on the political right to sort of embrace and hug Poland, like since the beginning of this war, and trying to sort of peel off Poland from Hungary in a way, but there aren't many takers on the American right. It seems that Orban has really become this sort of avatar for the sort of nationalist right through the connection to CPAC and through all the money that has been flowing in to the commentariat on the nationalist right, and my worry is not so much about Governor DeSantis trying to replicate the same sort of culture wars in Florida, but rather that together with these cultural conflicts, like he'll be also listening to some pretty bad geopolitical advice and advice on sort of actual policy matters that will shape the lives of Americans going forward. And we already saw some snippets of that when Governor DeSantis gets asked about the war in Ukraine. I am not among those who would be impressed very much by his answer. So yeah. So that is very much my worry. And much as I would not advise, the sort of Matthias Corvinus college model of propaganda as a general model, I almost wish that the Law and Justice Party did something similar and at least sort of presented American conservatives with a model of, sort of reactionary conservatism that is at least anti-Russian.
Well, then that goes to why I'm so glad I could get the two of you on here to talk about this, because Americans do get a very distorted view of what's going on. And I think your concern is that, the appeal to our domestic culture war things will distort our understanding of the actual geopolitics of the region. And that's why I was so glad to be able to get two of you on to give a more firsthand, more accurate impression of what is going on in Hungary and what the nature of that system is. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much, Rob.
I'm Rob Trzynski. My guests today have been David Baer and Dalibor Rohac, talking about the authoritarian or autocratic model in Hungary. If you enjoyed this conversation, please hit like on YouTube, follow us on your favorite podcasting platform, and you can always find more ideas about the nature of a free society at symposium.substack.com. Thank you for joining the conversation.